Another diversity hire trying to play soldier. General Donovan chuckled as she walked toward the Apache helicopter, his voice carrying across the tarmac with deliberate volume. Hope she realizes this isn't a flight simulator at some shopping mall arcade. She didn't flinch, didn't respond. 24 hours later, she was piloting that same Apache through enemy fire in the mountains of Korathia, executing precision strikes that saved an entire forward operating base while the general watched in stunned silence from command headquarters, realizing he had just witnessed combat flying that exceeded anything in his own decorated career. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Elena Vasquez wasn't new to military aviation or to the particular brand of skepticism that seemed to follow her wherever rotors turned and engines roared. She had logged over 1,800 hours of flight time across 3 different aircraft platforms, with 420 of those hours accumulated in active combat zones where mechanical failure, enemy fire, or pilot error meant death, not just a failed training exercise or a poor performance review. But she was definitely new to Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk, a classified installation nestled deep in the contested borderlands of Korathia, where only the most experienced combat pilots were stationed for what military intelligence classified as high-intensity asymmetric warfare operations. The base housed the 47th Attack Helicopter Squadron, an elite unit responsible for providing close air support to special operations forces conducting raids against insurgent strongholds in terrain so hostile that conventional ground forces couldn't establish lasting presence. Every pilot assigned to Thunderhawk had been hand-selected based on combat performance, technical expertise, and psychological evaluations that measured their ability to make split-second decisions under extreme pressure. While enemy tracers streaked past their cockpit windows, Elena was the only woman currently assigned to the squadron. She was also the youngest pilot to ever receive orders for Thunderhawk at just 28 years old, having been fast-tracked through advanced flight training programs after demonstrating exceptional aptitude for helicopter combat operations during her previous deployment in the desert regions of Maltahar. According to the personnel files that had preceded her arrival, she was also the only pilot in the squadron's history to have been personally recommended by 3 different commanding officers from 3 different theaters of operation. When she stepped onto the sun-baked tarmac of Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk that sweltering morning in July, wearing regulation desert camouflage flight gear with every piece of equipment positioned according to military specifications, carrying her mission planning tablet and reporting for her official integration briefing, General Harrison Donovan didn't offer the customary professional greeting that military protocol required for newly arrived personnel. Instead, he looked her up and down with obvious disdain, his weathered face creased into an expression that conveyed both condescension and barely concealed irritation. Then he deliberately turned toward the cluster of male pilots who had gathered near the maintenance hangar to observe the arrival of their new squadron number, and delivered his assessment with theatrical volume designed to ensure that every person within 50 yards could hear his commentary. "Well, this should be interesting," he announced, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Another diversity hire trying to play soldier. I just hope she realizes this isn't a flight simulator at some shopping mall arcade where you can restart the game when things go wrong." Cruel laughter rippled through the assembled group of pilots behind her, the kind of calculated mockery specifically designed to isolate and intimidate, rather than foster any sense of professional camaraderie or unit cohesion. Several of the men exchanged knowing glances and head shakes, as if they were witnessing the arrival of someone who clearly didn't belong in their exclusive fraternity of combat veterans. Elena maintained her composure completely. She didn't offer a defensive response about her qualifications or experience. She didn't attempt to justify her presence at the base with a recitation of her combat record or training achievements. She didn't waste energy on verbal sparring with someone who had obviously decided her worth before observing her capabilities or reviewing her performance history. Instead, she walked directly toward the flight operations building, methodically, organized her mission planning materials, and began reviewing the tactical situation reports that would familiarize her with the current operational environment. Her movements were deliberate and professional, conveying the focused efficiency of someone who understood that actions speak louder than arguments, and that competence is demonstrated through performance rather than through defensive explanations. General. Donovan shook his head with exaggerated disappointment and began walking toward the command center, clearly satisfied with his public humiliation of the new arrival. You'll be conducting familiarization flights with the AH-64 Apache tomorrow morning, he called over his shoulder without bothering to turn around. Try not to damage any expensive equipment while you're figuring out which buttons do what. What? General Donovan had conveniently failed to mention to Elena or to the assembled pilots was that Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk was currently operating under what military intelligence classified as imminent threat conditions. Enemy forces had been conducting increasingly sophisticated attacks against coalition positions throughout the region, and intelligence reports suggested that a major assault against the base itself was being planned for the near future. The Apache helicopters stationed at Thunderhawk weren't just conducting routine training missions or standard patrol operations. They were flying active combat sorties against confirmed enemy positions, providing fire support for special operations teams conducting high-risk raids, and serving as the primary defensive asset for the base when ground-based insurgent forces attempted to breach the perimeter defenses. Elena was about to be thrown into a combat environment where hesitation meant death, where split-second decisions determined whether friendly forces lived or died, and where the margin for error was measured in milliseconds rather than minutes. The general's dismissive attitude wasn't just unprofessional, it was potentially catastrophic for unit effectiveness in a combat zone where every pilot needed to perform at maximum capability. Elena had no way of knowing that within 24 hours she would be test flying that same Apache helicopter through enemy fire in the mountains of Korathia, executing precision strikes that would save an entire forward operating base while General Donovan watched in stunned silence from command headquarters, realizing he had just witnessed combat flying that exceeded anything in his own decorated career. Sometimes the most dangerous underestimation occurs when lives hang in the balance, and competence becomes a matter of survival rather than just professional pride. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Captain Elena Vasquez had earned her wings through merit, not politics, and her service record reflected a level of combat experience that most pilots twice her age had never accumulated. Born in the mountain town of Silverton, Colorado, she had grown up around aircraft. Her father ran a helicopter tour service that navigated tourists through treacherous canyon terrain where weather conditions could shift from clear skies to whiteout blizzards in minutes, teaching her from childhood that aviation demanded respect, precision, and split-second decision-making. Her military career had begun 8 years earlier when she enlisted straight out of high school, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and an irresistible attraction to the most challenging flying assignments the military could offer. Unlike many pilots who gravitated toward the relative safety of transport or reconnaissance missions, Elena had specifically requested combat helicopter training from the moment she qualified for flight school. Her instructors at Fort Ruckers Helicopter Training Facility had initially questioned whether someone of her slight build, barely 5 feet 4 inches and weighing less than 120 pounds, could handle the physical demands of piloting attack helicopters in combat conditions. Those doubts evaporated during her first leave-fire exercise, when she demonstrated the kind of natural coordination between hands, feet, and eyes that aviation instructors recognize maybe once in every 1,000 candidates. The AH-64 Apache helicopter is not an aircraft that forgives pilot error or rewards overconfidence. With a maximum gross weight of 23,000 pounds, twin turboshaft engines producing 1,700 horsepower each, and weapon systems capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 5 kilometers, the Apache demands a pilot who can simultaneously manage flight controls, navigation systems, communication equipment, target acquisition sensors, and multiple weapon platforms while operating in hostile environments where enemy forces are actively trying to kill them. Elena had mastered every system on the aircraft with the methodical thoroughness that characterized her approach to every challenge she encountered. She could disassemble and reassemble the M230 30mm chain gun in complete darkness. She could program the longbow radar system to discriminate between friendly and enemy vehicles at maximum detection range. She could calculate ammunition expenditure rates, fuel consumption patterns, and emergency landing zones while engaged in high-speed, tactical maneuvering through mountain terrain. But technical knowledge was only part of what made Elena exceptional. As a combat pilot, her real strength lay in her ability to remain calm and focused under the extreme stress conditions that cause many pilots to make fatal mistakes. During her deployment to the desert regions of Maltahar, she had flown 127 combat missions over an 18-month period, including 36 missions classified as troops in contact, where friendly forces were under immediate enemy fire and required emergency close air support. On 3 separate occasions, she had been the only available pilot when medical evacuation helicopters came under enemy attack and needed immediate armed escort through hostile territory. Each time, she had successfully guided the medical aircraft to safety while engaging enemy positions with precision that eliminated threats without causing collateral damage to civilian structures or personnel. Her most notable achievement had occurred during Operation Desert Falcon, when insurgent forces had surrounded a 12-man special operations team in a remote valley where conventional rescue forces couldn't penetrate due to the mountainous terrain and concentrated anti-aircraft defenses. Elena had volunteered to fly a solo mission through a narrow canyon approach that intelligence analysts considered suicidal due to the high probability of enemy ambush. Flying at extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection, she had navigated 15 miles of winding canyon terrain in complete radio silence, emerged directly above the surrounded special operations team, and provided sustained fire support that eliminated 17 enemy positions while consuming only 63 rounds of 30mm ammunition, a level of precision that military analysts later described as mathematically improbable under combat conditions. The special operations team had extracted without casualties, and Elena had returned to base with her aircraft damaged by enemy small arms fire but still flyable. The mission had earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross, making her the youngest helicopter pilot in military history to receive that decoration for combat actions. But achievements and decorations meant nothing to the pilots at Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk, who saw only a young woman invading their exclusive fraternity of combat veterans. They didn't know about her service record in Maltahar. They hadn't read the mission reports that documented her exceptional performance under fire. They certainly hadn't bothered to review the personnel files that explained exactly why 3 different commanding officers had personally recommended her for assignment to their elite squadron. All they saw was someone who didn't fit their preconceived image of what a combat helicopter pilot should look like, and they had already decided that her presence at Thunderhawk was the result of political correctness rather than professional competence. They were about to discover how wrong those assumptions could be when lives hung in the balance and performance was measured not by appearance or gender, but by the ability to deliver precision violence against enemy forces while keeping friendly Troops alive. Elena understood the skepticism she faced, because she had encountered it at every stage of her military career. But she had also learned that the most effective response to doubt was demonstration rather than explanation, and that competence speaks louder than any argument she could make about her qualifications or experience. Tomorrow morning, she would have the opportunity to show exactly what 8 years of combat flying had taught her about operating Apache helicopters in hostile environments. The question wasn't whether she belonged at Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk. The question was whether Thunderhawk was ready for what she brought to their combat operations. The morning briefing took place in the squadron's operations center, a prefabricated building reinforced with concrete barriers and surrounded by sandbags that served as protection against the mortar attacks that insurgent forces occasionally directed toward the base. Elena arrived precisely 15 minutes early, as was her habit, carrying her flight gear and mission planning materials in the regulation order that had become second nature after 8 years of military service. She took a seat in the back row of the briefing room, methodically arranging her notebook, tactical maps, and communication frequencies while the other pilots gradually filtered into the room. Their conversations were loud and casual, filled with the kind of crude humor and exaggerated war stories that combat pilots used to mask the underlying tension that comes with knowing each mission might be their last dot when General Donovan entered the room. The casual chatter immediately ceased, replaced by the kind of respectful silence that acknowledged his position as the commanding officer responsible for their survival in this hostile environment. He moved to the front of the briefing room with the confident stride of someone accustomed to absolute authority, positioned himself behind the podium, and began reviewing the day's operational requirements. Intelligence reports indicate increased insurgent activity in sectors 7 through 12, he announced, pointing to the large tactical map that dominated the front wall of the briefing room. We've got 3 special operations teams conducting reconnaissance missions in that area, and they're going to need air support if they make contact with enemy forces. He paused to scan the assembled pilots, his gaze lingering on Elena for several seconds longer than military protocol would typically require. Today we're also conducting integration training for our newest squadron member, he continued, his voice carrying the subtle edge of condescension that had characterized his attitude. Since her arrival, Captain Vasquez will be flying familiarization missions with one of our experienced pilots to help her understand how we conduct operations here at Thunderhawk, he explained to the room, although his tone suggested that he doubted her ability to understand anything more complex than basic aircraft operations. Then, General Donovan did something that Elena had never experienced in 8 years of military service. Instead of following standard protocol by announcing her assignment to a routine training mission with appropriate safety margins and controlled conditions, he deliberately assigned her to what the squadron classified as advanced tactical maneuvering exercises in the exact same mountainous terrain where insurgent forces had been conducting ambush attacks against coalition aircraft. She'll be conducting low-altitude navigation training through the Korathia mountain passes, he announced with obvious satisfaction, where she can practice basic flight skills without interfering with our actual combat operations. The assembled pilots exchanged knowing glances and barely suppressed smirks. Everyone in the room understood that the Korathia mountain passes represented some of the most dangerous flying conditions in the entire theater of operations. The terrain was characterized by narrow valleys with sheer canyon walls that rose more than 2,000 feet on either side, creating wind conditions that could slam an aircraft into solid rock with no warning. Weather patterns in the mountains were notoriously unpredictable, with visibility that could drop from clear skies to near zero conditions in a matter of minutes when cloud formations descended into the valleys. Navigation was complicated by the fact that GPS signals were frequently blocked by the surrounding peaks, forcing pilots to rely on visual reference points and dead reckoning techniques that required extensive experience with the local terrain. The real danger in the Korathian mountains wasn't weather or terrain. It was the enemy forces that had established positions throughout the region, specifically to target coalition aircraft. Intelligence reports documented at least 12 confirmed surface-to-air missile sites in the mountain passes, along with numerous small arms positions that insurgent forces used to engage low-flying helicopters. 3 coalition aircraft had been shot down in those mountains over the past 6 months, including an Apache helicopter flown by one of the squadron's most experienced pilots. The wreckage was still visible on the canyon floor, serving as a grim reminder of what happened when overconfidence met enemy fire in terrain that offered no escape routes for damaged aircraft. What made General Donovan's assignment particularly cruel was that he was disguising what amounted to a combat mission as a familiarization flight, sending Elena into hostile territory under the pretense of basic training, while knowing that she would be facing the same dangers that had killed experienced pilots with thousands of hours of combat flying. Major Rodriguez, the squadron's operations officer, shifted uncomfortably in his seat and cleared his throat diplomatically. "Sir, perhaps we should consider starting Captain Vasquez with some of our less challenging training routes before. I'm sure she'd be fine." General Donovan interrupted with dismissive authority. "After all, if she's qualified to be here, she should be able to handle a simple navigation exercise, shouldn't she?" The room fell into uncomfortable silence as everyone present recognized the trap that was being constructed. If Elena objected to the assignment, she would be confirming the general's assumption that she wasn't capable of handling the demands of combat flying. If she accepted the mission without protest, she would be flying into terrain where enemy forces were actively hunting coalition aircraft. Elena remained silent throughout the entire exchange, her expression calm and professional. Despite the obvious hostility being directed toward her, she understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't a training mission. It was a test designed to prove that she didn't belong at Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk, but she also understood something that General Donovan had failed to consider. She had flown similar terrain during her deployment in Maltahar, where mountain flying was complicated by the same combination of hostile weather, dangerous terrain, and enemy threats. The Korathian mountains might be unfamiliar, but the skills required to navigate them safely were identical to those she had been developing for the past 3 years. "Understood, sir," she replied simply, making no attempt to argue with the assignment or request additional support. "What time would you like me to depart?" General Donovan's smile was cold and satisfied. "Oh, 800 hours, he announced. "That should give you plenty of time to figure out whether you're really cut out for this kind of work." As the briefing concluded and the other pilots filed out of the room, Elena remained seated, methodically reviewing her tactical maps and calculating flight routes through the mountain passes. She was already formulating contingency plans for the various emergencies that could develop during mountain flying, from sudden weather changes to mechanical failures to enemy contact. What she didn't know was that within 6 hours, those contingency plans would prove to be the difference between life and death, not just for her, but for an entire special operations team that would find themselves surrounded by enemy forces with no hope of extraction except for the precision flying of a pilot that General Donovan had dismissed as inadequate for combat operations. Elena spent the remainder of that day in deliberate isolation, methodically preparing for a mission that everyone expected would expose her limitations as a pilot. While the other squadron members gathered in the recreation tent to play cards and share stories about their combat experiences, she remained in her assigned quarters, studying topographical maps of the Korathian mountain region with the focused intensity of someone who understood that preparation could mean the difference between successful mission completion and catastrophic failure. Her approach to mission planning had been shaped by years of flying in hostile environments where second chances didn't exist. She began by memorizing every geographical feature along her assigned route ridge lines, Valley floors, prominent peaks, and natural landmarks that could serve as navigation reference points if electronic systems failed or enemy jamming disabled. Her GPS equipment, she calculated fuel consumption rates for various flight profiles, from high-speed transit through open terrain to low-altitude maneuvering through narrow canyon passages where increased power requirements could dramatically reduce her operational range. She identified potential emergency landing zones, analyzed wind patterns based on topographical features, and studied historical weather data to understand how atmospheric conditions typically developed in the mountain region throughout the day. But Elena's preparation went far beyond standard flight planning procedures. She also researched every available intelligence report about enemy activity in the Korathian mountains, mapping the locations of confirmed anti-aircraft positions, studying the tactics that insurgent forces used to engage coalition aircraft, and identifying the specific threats she might encounter during what General Donovan had characterized as a simple familiarization flight. She knew that surface-to-air missiles posed the greatest threat to helicopter operations in mountainous terrain, where aircraft were forced to fly predictable routes through valleys that enemy forces could easily monitor and target. She reviewed the engagement profiles for the SA-7 and SA-14 missile systems that intelligence reports indicated were present in the region, calculating optimal evasive maneuver sequences and studying the terrain features that could provide protection. From guided missile attacks, small arms fire represented another significant danger, particularly in narrow valleys where enemy positions on elevated terrain could engage. Aircraft with rifle and machine gun fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Elena planned her route to minimize exposure to such attacks by utilizing terrain masking and varying her altitude and speed to prevent enemy gunners from establishing predictable targeting solutions. Throughout her preparation, Elena maintained the same professional demeanor that had characterized her response to General Donovan's obvious attempt to humiliate her in front of the squadron. She didn't complain about the unfairness of being assigned to dangerous terrain under the guise of training. She didn't seek sympathy from other pilots who might have been willing to acknowledge the hostile treatment she was receiving. Instead, she focused entirely on the technical and tactical challenges that the mission would present, approaching the assignment with the same methodical thoroughness that had enabled her to survive 127 combat missions in equally hostile environments. She understood that her performance during this flight would determine not just her future with the squadron, but potentially her entire military aviation career. The other pilots at Thunderhawk had no way of knowing that Elena's calm acceptance of the dangerous assignment wasn't naive confidence or reckless bravado. They couldn't see the extensive mission planning that she was conducting in private, or understand that her apparent lack of concern was actually the product of thorough preparation and hard-earned experience in similar operational environments. Major Rodriguez, the squadron operations officer who had attempted to intervene during the morning briefing, made one effort to approach Elena that evening as she reviewed her mission materials in the base dining facility. His expression was troubled, and his voice carried the weight of someone who understood the dangerous game that General Donovan was playing with a new pilot's safety. "Captain Vasquez," he said quietly, taking a seat across from her at the otherwise empty table. "I want you to know that tomorrow's mission, it's not what we'd normally assign to someone during their first week at Thunderhawk." Elena looked up from her maps and navigation charts, her expression polite but guarded. She had learned through experience that well-meaning colleagues could sometimes create more problems than they solved when they attempted to intervene in command decisions, regardless of their good intentions. "I appreciate your concern, Major," she replied diplomatically, "but I'm confident that I can handle whatever challenges the mission presents." Rodriguez leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to ensure their conversation remained private. "The Korathian mountains aren't like other training areas. We've lost aircraft in that terrain, including experienced pilots who knew the region well. The general is—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't constitute insubordination. Testing you in ways that aren't standard procedure, Elena." Nodded slowly, acknowledging his warning without revealing whether it concerned her. "Every mission involves risk, Major. My job is to minimize that risk through proper preparation and professional execution. If you encounter any problems tomorrow, mechanical issues, weather deterioration, anything that makes the mission unsafe, don't hesitate to abort and return to base." Rodriguez continued. "No training exercise is worth compromising aircraft or personnel safety." "Understood," Elena replied simply, though they both knew that aborting the mission would be interpreted by General Donovan as confirmation of her inadequacy as a combat pilot. Rodriguez studied her composed expression for several seconds, recognizing something in her demeanor that reminded him of the most competent pilots he had served with during his own combat deployments. There was no bravado in her attitude, no defensive posturing or emotional reaction to the obviously unfair treatment she was receiving. Instead, there was the quiet confidence of someone who had faced similar challenges before and developed the skills necessary to overcome them. After Rodriguez departed, Elena returned to her mission planning with renewed focus. She understood that tomorrow's flight would be more than just a test of her flying abilities. It would be a referendum on whether women belonged in combat aviation roles, at least in the minds of the pilots who would be watching her performance and drawing conclusions about her capabilities. But Elena had faced similar scrutiny throughout her military career, and she had learned that the most effective response to doubt was flawless execution rather than passionate arguments about equality or fairness. Tomorrow morning, she would demonstrate exactly what 8 years of combat flying had taught her about operating Apache helicopters in hostile environments, where competence was measured not by gender or appearance, but by the ability to complete dangerous missions and return safely to base. She had no way of knowing that within 12 hours, her careful preparation and professional expertise would be tested not in a controlled training environment, but in actual combat conditions where the lives of an entire special operations team would depend on her ability to perform under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The pre-dawn darkness at Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk was broken only by the red glow of runway lights and the steady hum of generators powering the base's essential systems. Elena arrived at the flight line at 0630 hours 90 minutes. Before her scheduled departure time, carrying her flight helmet, survival gear, and mission planning materials in the precise order that had become routine after years of combat operations. The AH-64 Apache, designated for her familiarization flight, sat on the tarmac like a predatory insect, its angular silhouette barely visible in the dim morning light. Aircraft number 471, according to her assignment sheet, had accumulated over 800 combat flight hours during its deployment to Korathia and bore the subtle scars that marked all aircraft operating in hostile environments. Small patches where bullet holes had been repaired, stress cracks in the fuselage that had been reinforced, and the faded paint that came from exposure to desert sand and mountain weather. Elena began her pre-flight inspection with the methodical thoroughness that distinguished professional pilots from those who relied on luck to survive dangerous missions. She examined every critical component of the aircraft, from the main rotor blades to the tail rotor assembly, checking for signs of fatigue, damage, or wear that could result in mechanical failure during flight operations. The Apache's twin General Electric T700 turboshaft engines showed normal wear patterns consistent with their operational history. The transmission systems displayed proper fluid levels and no signs of leakage that might indicate impending failure. The flight control systems responded correctly to input commands, and the weapons systems completed their built-in test sequences without error codes that would indicate malfunctioning equipment. But Elena's inspection went beyond standard checklist procedures. She personally verified the functionality of every backup system that might be required if primary systems failed during flight operations. She tested the emergency power systems, confirmed the operation of manual flight controls that would be necessary if hydraulic systems were damaged, and ensured that communication equipment was properly configured for the frequencies used by Special Operations Forces in the Korathian mountain region. As she completed her inspection, other pilots began arriving at the flight line to prepare for their own missions. Their conversations were subdued, lacking the usual casual banter that typically characterized morning briefings. Everyone understood that Elena's assignment to the Korathian mountains represented more than just a training exercise. It was General Donovan's attempt to prove that she didn't belong in their squadron. Captain Mitchell Torres, one of the squadron's most experienced pilots, approached Elena as she conducted her final equipment checks. Torres had flown over 200 combat missions during his 3 deployments to various conflict zones, and his reputation for both skill and professionalism was well established among the Thunderhawk personnel. "Captain Vasquez," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. "I've flown those mountain routes dozens of times. The terrain is unforgiving, and the weather can change faster than you can react to it. If you encounter any problems, mechanical, weather or otherwise, don't hesitate to call for assistance." Elena looked up from her checklist, recognizing the sincerity in Torres's offer of support. Unlike the crude mockery she had received from other squadron members, his words reflected the professional courtesy that should exist between pilots operating in dangerous environments. "I appreciate that, Captain Torres," she replied. "What's the typical response time for search and rescue operations in that region?" Torres's expression darkened slightly. "That's the problem," he admitted. "The mountains create communication. Dead zones where radio contact with base operations becomes intermittent or impossible. If something goes wrong in the deeper valleys, you might be on your own for several hours before rescue forces can locate and reach your position." The implications of his warning were clear. Elena would be flying into terrain where help might not be available if she encountered difficulties, where pilot error or mechanical failure could result in isolation in enemy-controlled territory with no immediate prospect of rescue. "Understood," Elena responded calmly, though she was already incorporating this information into her emergency contingency planning. "Are there any specific areas where communication is consistently problematic?" Torres pulled out a worn tactical map and pointed to several valley systems that snaked through the mountain range like dark arteries. "These 3 valleys are the worst for radio blackouts," he explained. "The canyon walls block satellite signals, and the terrain features interfere with line-of-sight communication with base stations." Elena studied the map carefully, memorizing the locations where she might lose contact with Thunderhawk Operations Center. She was already planning communication check-in schedules that would ensure someone knew her approximate position, even if radio contact became intermittent. At 0745 hours, 15 minutes before her scheduled departure time, General Donovan appeared at the flight line accompanied by 2 other senior officers, whose presence suggested that Elena's mission was attracting more attention than a routine familiarization flight would normally warrant. The general's expression was confident and expectant, as if he was anticipating a satisfying confirmation of his assessment of her capabilities. "Ready for your mountain flying lesson, Captain?" he asked with obvious condescension, his voice loud enough for the other pilots to hear. "I hope you've studied your maps carefully, because navigation can be challenging when you're not flying over flat terrain with clearly marked landmarks." Elena secured her mission planning materials in the cockpit and turned to face the general with professional composure. "Aircraft pre-flight inspection complete, sir. All systems operational and within acceptable parameters. Ready for departure on schedule." Her response was exactly what military protocol required, a factual report on aircraft status, without any emotional reaction to his provocation. General Donovan seemed slightly disappointed that she hadn't provided him with an opportunity for additional mockery. "Your mission parameters are simple," he continued, unfolding a map that showed her assigned route through the mountain passes. "Navigate through waypoints Alpha through Delta. Conduct visual reconnaissance of the specified terrain features and return to base. Should be straightforward enough for someone with your background." Elena accepted the map and reviewed the route quickly, noting that it would take her through some of the most challenging terrain in the region, including narrow valleys where maneuvering options would be severely limited. The waypoints were positioned to require low-altitude flying through areas where enemy forces had been most active, maximizing her exposure to potential threats. "Estimated flight time 4 hours and 20 minutes, she reported, after calculating distances and flight speeds. "Weather forecast shows acceptable conditions for the scheduled route." General Donovan nodded with satisfaction. "Excellent. I'm sure it will be an educational experience for you." As Elena climbed into the Apache's front cockpit and began her engine start sequence, she had no way of knowing that 12 miles away, in a remote valley that wasn't included in her mission planning materials, a 12-man special operations team designated Viper 6 was already under enemy fire and calling desperately for immediate air support that wasn't scheduled to arrive for another 6 hours. Within 90 minutes, her simple familiarization flight would become a life-or-death combat mission that would test every skill she had developed during 8 years of military aviation, while General Donovan watched from the operations center and realized that he had completely misjudged the capabilities of the pilot he had dismissed as inadequate for combat operations. What General Harrison Donovan had carefully concealed from Elena, from the assembled squadron pilots, and from the official mission briefing, was information that would have fundamentally changed everyone's understanding of the assignment he had just given to the pilot he considered unqualified for combat operations at Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk. 6 months earlier, during what military records classified as Exercise Mountain Thunder, General Donovan himself had attempted to navigate the exact same route through the Korathian mountain passes that he had just assigned to Elena as a simple familiarization flight. The exercise had been designed to evaluate senior officers' proficiency with advanced helicopter operations in challenging terrain, and Donovan's performance had been observed by a team of evaluation specialists from the Pentagon who were conducting readiness assessments for all forward-deployed combat units. The first attempt had ended in what the evaluation report diplomatically termed navigational difficulties requiring emergency assistance. General Donovan had become disoriented in the narrow valleys where GPS signals were blocked by surrounding peaks, and had been forced to request immediate guidance from base operations to find his way back to identifiable terrain features. The incident had been witnessed by Colonel Patricia Hawkins, the senior evaluation officer, who had documented his confusion and inability to maintain proper navigation in challenging conditions. But the real humiliation had occurred during his second attempt to complete the mountain route, which had been scheduled 2 weeks later to give him additional preparation time and an opportunity to demonstrate improved performance. This time, Donovan had flown with an experienced co-pilot specifically assigned to provide assistance if navigation problems developed again during the evaluation exercise. Despite the additional support and preparation time, General Donovan had again become lost in the mountain terrain, this time in conditions of reduced visibility caused by cloud formations that had descended into the valleys while he was attempting to navigate between waypoints. The situation had deteriorated to the point where his co-pilot had been forced to take control of the aircraft to prevent a potential collision with terrain that Donovan had not seen due to his disorientation and inadequate instrument flying skills. The evaluation report had noted significant deficiencies in mountain flying proficiency and had recommended additional training before General Donovan should be cleared for independent operations in similar terrain. The recommendation had been classified and filed in his permanent record, where it remained as documentation of his inability to successfully complete the same mission. He was now assigning to Elena that, more damaging to his professional reputation, was the fact that his failures had been witnessed by multiple personnel, including the evaluation team, his assigned co-pilot, and the operations center staff who had monitored his radio communications during both unsuccessful attempts. Word of his poor performance had spread quietly through the aviation community, creating a reputation that undermined his credibility when evaluating other pilots' capabilities. The bitter irony was that General Donovan's hostility toward Elena stemmed largely from his own insecurity about his flying abilities and his fear that a competent pilot might expose his limitations by successfully completing missions that had defeated him. His decision to assign her to the mountain route wasn't just professional bias or gender discrimination. It was a desperate attempt to protect his own reputation by ensuring that someone else would also fail in the same challenging conditions. Colonel Hawkins, the Pentagon evaluation officer who had documented Donovan's failures, had specifically noted in her report that the Korathian mountain route required exceptional proficiency in instrument navigation, terrain masking techniques, and emergency procedures that exceed standard helicopter training requirements. She had recommended that the route be classified as suitable only for pilots with extensive mountain flying experience and demonstrated competence in challenging conditions. General Donovan's assignment of this route to Elena under the pretense of basic familiarization training violated the evaluation team's recommendations and represented what military regulations would classify as reckless endangerment of personnel through inappropriate mission assignment. If Colonel Hawkins learned of his decision, it could result in formal disciplinary action and potential removal from command. Donovan's greatest fear wasn't disciplinary action from his superiors. It was the possibility that Elena might successfully complete the mountain route that had defeated him twice, thereby demonstrating that his failures had been due to inadequate skill rather than exceptional difficulty of the mission. Such a demonstration would irreparably damage his credibility and might trigger a formal review of his fitness for command in a combat environment. The classified nature of his evaluation failures meant that Elena had no access to information that would have revealed the true nature of the challenge she was facing. She was preparing for a mission that her commanding officer had been unable to complete successfully, despite his superior rank, extensive military experience, and the additional support resources that had been provided during his evaluation. Attempts. Meanwhile, in a remote valley 14 miles northeast of Elena's planned route, Special Operations Team Viper 6 was conducting what intelligence reports had classified as a routine reconnaissance mission in an area where enemy activity was believed to be minimal. The team consisted of 12 highly trained soldiers who had been tasked with gathering information about insurgent supply routes that intelligence analysts suspected were being used to transport weapons and ammunition to enemy forces throughout the region. Team leader Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane had positioned his soldiers in observation posts overlooking a narrow mountain pass where they could monitor vehicle traffic without being detected by enemy forces. Their mission was scheduled to last 72 hours, after which they would be extracted by helicopter and returned to their forward operating base with intelligence that would be used to plan future interdiction operations. But intelligence reports about minimal enemy activity in the region had been catastrophically wrong. Instead of the small groups of insurgents that analysts had predicted, Viper 6 found themselves observing a major enemy operation involving more than 60 heavily armed fighters who were using the mountain pass to transport sophisticated weapons systems, including surface-to-air missiles and crew-served machine guns that could engage coalition aircraft at extended ranges. Even worse, the enemy forces had detected the presence of the Special Operations Team and were beginning to deploy tactical units to surround their position. Staff Sergeant Kane's communications with base operations had been disrupted by the mountainous terrain, leaving his team isolated and unable to call for immediate support as enemy forces closed in on their location. At 0800 hours, exactly as Elena was lifting off from Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk for her navigation training flight, Viper 6 came under intense enemy fire from multiple directions. Their position was being overrun by superior numbers of enemy fighters, and their only hope for survival was immediate air support from attack helicopters that could engage the enemy forces and provide cover for emergency extraction. The nearest scheduled air support was still 6 hours away, and Viper 6 didn't have 6 hours. They had perhaps 60 minutes before their ammunition was exhausted and their position was completely overrun by enemy forces who had already demonstrated their willingness to execute captured coalition personnel. Elena was flying toward her first waypoint in the Korathian mountains, unaware that her training mission was about to become the most important combat operation of her military career, while General Donovan watched from the operations center, expecting to witness her failure in the same terrain that had defeated his own attempts at mountain navigation. Elena lifted off from Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk at precisely 0800 hours, her Apache helicopter rising smoothly into the crisp morning air as the twin turbine engines reached optimal operating temperature. The familiar vibration of the rotors and the steady hum of mechanical systems created the controlled environment where she felt most confident, where years of training and combat experience converged into the instinctive responses that separated professional pilots from those who merely operated aircraft. Her initial heading took her northeast toward the foothills of the Korathian mountain range, following a route that would gradually increase in difficulty as she approached the narrow valleys and steep terrain that characterized the region's most challenging flying conditions. The early morning visibility was excellent, with clear skies and calm winds that made navigation straightforward as long as she remained in the open terrain surrounding Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk. But Elena understood that conditions would deteriorate rapidly once she entered the mountain valleys, where unpredictable wind patterns, reduced visibility, and communication difficulties would test every aspect of her flying skills. She methodically checked her navigation systems, confirmed her communication frequencies, and reviewed her emergency procedures one final time before committing to the route that General Donovan had assigned as her introduction to operations. In the Korathian region, 20-5 minutes into her flight, as she approached the first waypoint designated Alpha on her mission planning map, Elena began to appreciate the true complexity of the terrain she was entering. The mountains rose abruptly from the desert floor, creating a maze of intersecting valleys and ridgelines that looked dramatically different from the neat, geometric patterns shown on topographical maps. Wind conditions became noticeably more turbulent as she flew deeper into the mountain region, with sudden gusts and shifting air currents that required constant adjustments to maintain stable flight. The Apache responded well to her control inputs, but she could feel the increased workload that mountain flying demanded from both pilot and aircraft. Navigation became more challenging as GPS signals began to weaken due to interference from the surrounding peaks. Elena switched to backup navigation methods. Using visual reference points and dead reckoning, navigation became more challenging as GPS signals began to weaken due to interference from the surrounding peaks. Elena switched to backup navigation methods. Using visual reference points and dead reckoning techniques that relied on her ability to maintain accurate headings and calculate distances based on flight time and airspeed. At waypoint Alpha, she executed a precise turn toward the southeast that would take her through the first of the narrow valley systems that comprised the most dangerous portion of her assigned route. As she descended to the altitude specified in her mission parameters, the canyon walls rose on either side of her aircraft like the walls of a natural cathedral, creating an enclosed environment where maneuvering options were severely limited. It was here, flying through a valley so narrow that her rotor tips were less than 50 feet from the rocky walls on either side, that Lena's radio crackled with an emergency transmission that would transform her training mission into something entirely different. Any coalition aircraft, any coalition aircraft. This is Viper 6 requesting immediate close air support. Grid coordinates 417892. Troops in contact. Urgent, urgent, urgent. The transmission was broken and filled with static due to the mountainous terrain, but Elena could hear the desperation in the voice of whoever was calling for help. More importantly, she could hear the sound of automatic weapons fire in the background, indicating that friendly forces were engaged in active combat and needed immediate assistance. Elena quickly plotted the coordinates on her navigation system and realized that Viper 6 was located approximately 12 miles from her current position, in a valley system that wasn't included in her official mission parameters but was accessible through a series of connecting ridgelines that she could navigate if she deviated from her assigned route. Military protocol was clear about such situations. Pilots conducting training missions were not authorized to respond to emergency calls without explicit permission from their commanding authority. Elena was supposed to relay the emergency transmission to Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk and continue with her assigned mission while other assets were dispatched to provide the requested support. Elena also knew that the mountainous terrain would make radio communication with Thunderhawk Operations Center extremely difficult, and that by the time she could establish contact, receive permission to divert, and actually reach the coordinates where Viper 6 was under fire, the situation might have deteriorated beyond the point where air support could be effective. Viper 6, this is Apache 471, she transmitted, making a decision that would define not just her military career, but potentially the survival of 12 special operations soldiers. I'm approximately 12 minutes from your position. Can you provide tactical situation report? The response came immediately, with the sound of incoming fire clearly audible in the background. Apache 471, we are surrounded by approximately 60 enemy fighters with crew-served weapons and RPGs. We have wounded personnel and are running low on ammunition. Request immediate fire support to enable extraction. Elena's mind raced through the tactical calculations that would be required to provide effective support to ground forces in mountainous terrain while operating a single Apache helicopter without backup or coordinated support from other aircraft. She would be engaging a numerically superior enemy force in terrain that favored defenders, with limited ammunition and fuel reserves that had been planned for a navigation exercise rather than sustained combat operations. But she also understood that 12 American soldiers were about to be overrun by enemy forces, and that she was the only coalition asset in position to provide immediate assistance. The decision between following protocol and saving lives wasn't really a decision at all. It was a test of everything she had learned about the responsibilities that came with the privilege of flying combat aircraft. Viper 6, I'm en route to your position, she transmitted while simultaneously changing course toward the coordinates, where friendly forces were fighting for their survival. Can you mark your position with smoke or other visual identification? Negative on smoke, Apache 471. We're in a rocky outcropping on the north side of the valley floor. Enemy positions are on elevated terrain to our south and east. We'll mark our location with signal mirror when you're in visual range. Elena pushed her Apache to maximum sustainable speed while calculating approach angles that would allow her to engage enemy positions without endangering the surrounded special operations team. She was flying toward a combat situation without backup support, adequate ammunition reserves, or authorization from her command structure. Exactly the kind of unauthorized action that could result in court-martial proceedings if her intervention failed to achieve the desired results. But failure wasn't an option when American lives hung in the balance, and Elena had never failed to complete a mission when the stakes were measured in human survival rather than training exercise parameters. She was about to demonstrate exactly why 3 different commanding officers had recommended her for assignment to the most challenging operations in military aviation, in the Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk. Communication specialists were monitoring radio frequencies when they intercepted fragments of Elena's emergency communications with Viper 6. General Donovan was immediately notified that his familiarization flight pilot had apparently encountered a combat situation and was responding without authorization. His initial reaction was fury at what he perceived as Elena's violation of protocol and unauthorized deviation from her assigned mission. But as more details became available about the nature of the emergency and the tactical situation facing Viper 6, his anger began to transform into something approaching panic as he realized that the pilot he had dismissed as inadequate was about to face the kind of combat challenge that would test the abilities of even the most experienced aviators in his squadron. Elena's Apache crested the final ridgeline, separating her from Viper 6's position, and the tactical situation that revealed itself below was worse than anything the radio transmissions had conveyed. The Special Operations Team was pinned down in a rocky outcropping barely 30 meters wide, surrounded by enemy positions that had been carefully established on elevated terrain that provided commanding fields of fire across the entire valley floor. Through her targeting system's magnified optics, Elena could see muzzle flashes from at least 15 different enemy positions, arrayed in a horseshoe formation around the trapped Americans. Heavy machine gun tracers were converging on the small defensive perimeter where Viper 6 had taken cover, while rocket-propelled grenades exploded against the rocks with devastating frequency that indicated the enemy forces possessed substantial ammunition reserves. More concerning was her observation of enemy fighters moving through concealed positions to complete the encirclement of the American team. Elena counted at least 20 additional insurgents maneuvering to cut off any possible escape routes, while others were establishing firing positions that would enable them to engage her Apache helicopter from multiple directions simultaneously. If she attempted to provide close air support, the terrain itself presented tactical challenges that would have been difficult for an entire squadron of attack helicopters working in coordination. The valley was narrow enough that Elena's maneuvering options were severely restricted, with steep canyon walls that rose more than 1,000 feet on either side. Enemy positions were integrated into the natural rock formations in ways that would make them extremely difficult to target accurately, without risking collateral damage to the friendly forces they were trying to rescue. Viper 6, Apache 471 has visual on your position, Elena transmitted while simultaneously analyzing potential attack approaches that might neutralize enough enemy positions to enable extraction of the surrounded team. I count approximately 40 enemy positions with crew-served weapons. Do you have any wounded personnel who cannot move independently? Staff Sergeant Kane's response was nearly drowned out by the sound of incoming fire. Apache 471, we have 3 wounded, 2 seriously. We cannot move from this position without immediate suppression of enemy positions on the southern ridgeline. Elena studied this southern ridgeline through her targeting system and identified the enemy positions that posed the greatest threat to any extraction attempt. The insurgents had positioned their heavy weapons to create interlocking fields of fire that would make movement across the valley floor virtually impossible for ground forces. Neutralizing those positions would require precision engagement from multiple attack angles while avoiding the surface-to-air missiles that intelligence reports indicated were present in the region, but Elena understood that hesitation would be fatal for the Americans trapped below. Every minute that passed allowed enemy forces to strengthen their positions and reduce the Viper 6. I'm beginning my attack run, she transmitted while configuring her weapon systems for the most complex engagement of her military career. Keep your heads down and be ready to move when I give the signal. Elena initiated her attack. Approach using terrain masking techniques that utilize the natural contours of the canyon walls to conceal her helicopter from enemy observation until the moment of engagement. She flew at extremely low altitude along the valley floor, using the rocky terrain to break up her aircraft's radar signature, while calculating firing solutions for the enemy positions that posed the greatest threat to Viper 6. Her first target was a heavy machine gun position established on a rocky ledge, approximately 800 meters from the trapped American team. The enemy gunners had excellent fields of fire across the valley floor and were preventing any movement by friendly forces. Elena lined up her shot while maintaining forward airspeed that would carry her past the target area before enemy forces could engage her aircraft with return fire. The Apache's 30mm chain gun responded with mechanical precision, sending a burst of high explosive rounds into the enemy position with accuracy that eliminated the machine gun crew and destroyed their weapon system. But Elena's attack had also revealed her position to every enemy fighter in the valley, and within seconds, the air around her helicopter was filled with tracer rounds and rocket-propelled grenades fired by insurgents who were determined to bring down the aircraft that threatened their tactical advantage. Elena immediately initiated evasive maneuvers while simultaneously acquiring her next target, a mortar position that had been dropping rounds dangerously close to Viper 6's defensive perimeter. The enemy mortar crew was positioned behind rocky cover that would require a precision shot at an extremely steep angle to neutralize effectively, while pulling her Apache into a climbing turn that would provide the necessary firing angle. Elena felt the aircraft shudder as small arms fire from multiple enemy positions impacted her fuselage. Warning lights flickered on her instrument panel, indicating damage to non-critical systems that wouldn't immediately affect flight operations, but reduced her aircraft's combat effectiveness. She ignored the damage warnings and concentrated on placing her second burst of 30mm rounds exactly where they would eliminate the mortar threat, without causing a secondary explosion that might endanger the friendly forces she was trying to protect. The shot was perfect, destroying the mortar position and eliminating another source of indirect fire that had been preventing Viper 6 from repositioning to more defensible terrain. But Elena's attack had come at a cost. Her aircraft had absorbed significant damage from enemy small arms fire, and she was now operating with reduced hydraulic pressure and compromised navigation systems. More critically, her ammunition reserves were being depleted rapidly due to the precision shooting required to neutralize enemy positions without endangering friendly forces. Viper 6, 2 enemy positions neutralized. She transmitted while beginning her approach to the third target, a cluster of enemy fighters who had established an ambush position that would prevent extraction helicopters from landing anywhere in the valley. Prepare to move to the eastern wall of the valley when I engage the next target. Elena's third attack run took her directly over the center of the valley floor, where enemy forces from multiple directions could engage her aircraft simultaneously. The Apache was designed to withstand significant battle damage, but the volume of fire directed at her helicopter was testing the limits of both the aircraft's protective systems and her ability to maintain controlled flight while conducting precision attacks. As she lined up her shot on the enemy ambush position, Elena could see rocket-propelled grenades being fired at her aircraft from at least 3 different locations. She had perhaps 5 seconds to complete her attack and begin evasive maneuvers before the incoming rounds would impact her helicopter with potentially catastrophic results. The 30mm cannon fired its deadly burst just as Elena pulled her Apache into a steep diving turn that carried her below the trajectory of the incoming rockets. The enemy ambush position was eliminated, but her aircraft was now flying at dangerously low altitude in terrain that offered limited maneuvering room and maximum exposure to enemy ground fire. In the operations center at Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk, General Donovan was monitoring Elena's radio communications with growing amazement and terror. The pilot he had dismissed as inadequate for combat operations was single-handedly engaging a superior enemy force in terrain conditions that would challenge the most experienced aviators in his squadron. Her tactical decisions were flawless. Her gunnery was precise, and her flying was demonstrating a level of skill that exceeded anything he had witnessed during his own military career. But Elena's Apache was taking heavy damage. Her ammunition was running critically low, and she was still 12 minutes away from the nearest backup support that could assist with extraction of Viper 6. General Donovan was beginning to understand that he was witnessing either the most heroic rescue operation in recent military history, or the destruction of both an irreplaceable pilot and the special operations team she was trying to save. Elena's fourth attack run was executed with the kind of precision that separated legendary combat pilots from those who merely survived dangerous missions. Despite the heavy damage her Apache had sustained and the dwindling ammunition reserves that forced her to make every shot count, she maneuvered her aircraft through the narrow valley with mechanical perfection that demonstrated years of combat experience under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Her target was the most dangerous enemy position, remaining a crew-served anti-aircraft gun that insurgent forces had positioned specifically to engage coalition helicopters attempting rescue operations in the valley. The weapon system was capable of destroying her Apache with a single well-placed burst, but its elimination was essential if extraction helicopters were going to be able to reach Viper 6 before the special operations team was completely overrun. Elena approached the target using the combination of terrain masking and unpredictable flight patterns that made it impossible for enemy gunners to establish a predictable targeting solution. She flew her damaged helicopter through a series of rapid altitude changes and direction reversals that would have been challenging for an undamaged aircraft, while simultaneously calculating the precise firing solution required to neutralize the anti-aircraft position. The shot had to be perfect. Elena's remaining ammunition was insufficient for multiple attempts, and her aircraft's compromised hydraulic systems meant that maneuvering after the attack would be significantly more difficult than during her previous engagement runs. She would have one opportunity to eliminate the threat, and failure would likely result in the destruction of her helicopter and the deaths of everyone she was trying to rescue. As Elena lined up her final attack, the anti-aircraft gun crew spotted her approach and began traversing their weapon to engage her aircraft. She could see the muzzle of the heavy gun swinging toward her position, calculating that she had perhaps 3 seconds before enemy fire would begin impacting her helicopter with devastating effect. Elena fired her remaining 30mm rounds in a perfectly controlled burst that struck the anti-aircraft position with surgical precision, eliminating the weapon crew and destroying the gun system that had threatened both her aircraft and any future rescue attempts. The explosion was immediate and complete, sending debris cascading down the rocky slope, while secondary detonations indicated that ammunition stored near the position had been ignited by her attack. But Elena's aircraft was now operating with severely degraded systems and no remaining ammunition for her primary weapon system. Her hydraulic pressure had dropped to minimum operational levels, making flight control increasingly difficult, while warning lights on her instrument panel indicated damage to multiple critical systems that could result in catastrophic failure if stressed beyond their current limitations. Viper 6, all identified enemy positions have been neutralized. Elena transmitted while struggling to maintain controlled flight with her damaged aircraft. You are clear to move to the extraction landing zone on the eastern side of the valley. Extraction helicopters are en route to your position. Staff Sergeant Kane's response reflected both relief and amazement at what he had just witnessed. Apache 471, that was the most incredible flying I've ever seen. You just saved 12 lives with shooting. That shouldn't be possible under these conditions. Elena was already calculating whether her damaged helicopter could remain airborne long enough to provide security for the extraction operation when her aircraft's master caution system activated, indicating multiple system failures that required immediate attention. Her primary hydraulic system had failed completely, forcing her to rely on backup systems that provided minimal flight control authority in an aircraft that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. More critically, her fuel consumption had increased dramatically due to the combat maneuvering and system damage, leaving her with insufficient reserves to return to Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk if she remained in the area to provide security for Viper 6's extraction. Elena was facing a choice between abandoning the Special Operations Team before extraction was complete, or risking the loss of her aircraft and potentially her life by attempting to maintain protective coverage with a helicopter that was rapidly becoming UNFLYABLE. Thought the decision wasn't really a choice at all. Elena had never abandoned personnel under her protection, and she wasn't going to start when 12 American soldiers were depending on her continued presence to ensure their safe evacuation from enemy territory. Viper 6, I'll maintain overwatch until extraction is complete, she transmitted while manually compensating for the flight control problems that were making every minute of continued flight more dangerous than the last. Continue moving toward the landing zone and prepare for helicopter extraction. In the operations center at Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk, the radio communications being monitored by General Donovan and his staff painted a picture of combat heroism that exceeded anything in recent military aviation history. Elena had single-handedly engaged and defeated a superior enemy force in terrain conditions that military analysts would later classify as among the most challenging ever encountered by coalition forces. But the real shock for General Donovan wasn't Elena's flawless execution of an impossible mission. It was the growing realization that she had accomplished what he himself had been unable to do during his own evaluation attempts in the same mountain region. While he had become disoriented and required assistance to navigate through valleys where visibility was clear and no enemy forces were present, Elena had conducted precision combat operations in the same terrain while under heavy fire and managing severe aircraft damage. Colonel Patricia Hawkins, the Pentagon evaluation officer who had documented General Donovan's failures 6 months earlier, was coincidentally visiting Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk to conduct follow-up assessments of pilot proficiency in the region. She had been monitoring Elena's emergency response from the operations center, and her expression reflected both professional admiration and growing concern about the command decisions that had resulted in an unauthorized pilot conducting solo combat operations without backup support. General Donovan, Colonel Hawkins said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who outranked everyone present. I want a complete briefing on how Captain Vasquez came to be conducting combat operations in the Korathian Mountains. My understanding was that she was assigned to familiarization training, not emergency response missions. General Donovan's face had gone pale as he realized that his attempt to humiliate Elena had instead resulted in her demonstrating superior flying abilities in front of the same evaluation officer, who had documented his own inadequacies in identical terrain. The irony was devastating. Elena had just completed flawlessly the exact mission that had defeated him twice under much less challenging conditions. Sir, the communications specialist announced from his monitoring station, extraction helicopters report visual contact with Viper 6. Landing zone is secure and evacuation is proceeding as planned. But Elena's Apache was now operating on emergency power with multiple system failures that made continued flight extremely hazardous. Her fuel reserves were approaching minimum levels required for return to base, and her aircraft's damaged systems were creating flight conditions that tested every skill she had developed during years of emergency procedures training. Colonel Hawkins turned to General Donovan with an expression that conveyed both professional disappointment and barely controlled anger. Captain Vasquez has just demonstrated exceptional proficiency in terrain where your own evaluation attempts were unsuccessful. I want to understand exactly how this situation developed, and why one of the most challenging combat missions in recent memory was being conducted by a pilot you've characterized as inadequate for operations in this region." General Donovan stood frozen behind the radio console, finally understanding that Elena's extraordinary performance had not only saved 12 American lives, but had also exposed his own limitations as a pilot and as a commanding officer responsible for accurately assessing the capabilities of personnel under his command. The pilot he had dismissed as a diversity hire had just completed a mission that would be studied in military academies as an example of exceptional aviator skill. Under impossible conditions, Elena's voice crackled over the radio one final time. As extraction operations concluded successfully, Thunderhawk operations, Viper 6 extraction complete, all personnel accounted for. Apache 471 returning to base with battle damage and minimum fuel reserves. In that moment, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a demonstration of combat flying excellence that would be remembered long after the details of General Donovan's prejudice and poor judgment were forgotten. Elena's damaged Apache limped back to Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk on backup hydraulic systems and emergency power, trailing smoke from damaged engine components while she manually compensated for flight control problems that would have defeated most pilots under normal conditions. The 37-minute return flight required constant attention to engine parameters, fuel management, and emergency procedures that tested every skill she had developed during 8 years of military aviation. She landed her battle-damaged helicopter on the Thunderhawk flight line with the same precision that had characterized her combat operations, touching down smoothly despite hydraulic failures that made control inputs unpredictable and dangerous. As the rotors spun down and the turbine engines powered off, maintenance personnel immediately swarmed around the aircraft to assess the extensive damage that Elena's Apache had sustained during the most intense single-aircraft combat engagement in recent military history. The maintenance chief's preliminary inspection revealed bullet holes in non-critical fuselage sections, hydraulic fluid leaks from damaged lines, and stress fractures in rotor components that indicated the aircraft had been operated at maximum performance limits under extreme combat conditions. But remarkably, no damage had been sustained to flight-critical systems that would have resulted in loss of the aircraft or pilot during the emergency mission. Elena climbed down from her cockpit with the same professional composure that had characterized her response to General Donovan's initial dismissal, showing no external signs of the adrenaline and physical stress that accompanied intense combat operations. She methodically secured her flight gear, retrieved her mission planning materials, and began walking toward the operations center where she would be required to provide a detailed briefing on the emergency mission that had transformed her training flight into a life-saving combat operation. But before she could reach the operations building, Elena found herself facing General Donovan, who had left the communications center and was standing on the flight line with an expression that reflected a complex mixture of emotions she had never seen from a commanding officer. Behind him stood Colonel Patricia Hawkins, the Pentagon evaluation officer whose presence suggested that Elena's unauthorized combat mission would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate rescue of Viper 6. For several seconds, the three officers stood in silence on the tarmac while jet engines and helicopter rotors created a background of mechanical noise that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the situation they were confronting. Elena maintained military bearing and professional demeanor while waiting for General Donovan to speak first, following protocol that required subordinate officers to defer to senior commanders, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them together. General Donovan's voice, when he finally spoke, lacked the condescending tone that had characterized his previous interactions with Elena. Instead, his words carried the weight of someone who had been forced to confront fundamental assumptions about leadership, competence, and professional judgment that had been exposed as completely wrong by recent events. "Captain Vasquez," he began slowly, choosing his words with obvious care, "I owe you an apology that goes far beyond the normal bounds of military courtesy. My assessment of your capabilities was not only unprofessional, it was dangerously wrong, in ways that could have cost American lives if you hadn't possessed the skills and judgment to respond appropriately to an emergency situation." Elena listened without interrupting, maintaining the respectful silence that military protocol required, while her commanding officer continued with what was clearly one of the most difficult conversations of his career. "Your performance today in the Korathian Mountains demonstrated flying abilities that exceed those of any pilot currently assigned to this base, including my own," General Donovan continued, his admission carrying the weight of genuine humility, rather than diplomatic courtesy. "You successfully completed a combat mission that I myself was unable to accomplish during evaluation exercises conducted under much less challenging conditions." Colonel Hawkins stepped forward at this point, her expression reflecting both professional approval of Elena's performance and obvious concern about the command decisions that had resulted in an unauthorized combat mission. Her voice carried the authority of someone whose recommendations could affect the careers of everyone present. "Captain Vasquez," Colonel Hawkins said formally, "your actions today will be documented as an example of exceptional pilot performance under combat conditions. However, I need to understand the circumstances that resulted in your assignment to the Korathian mountain region without adequate preparation or support resources." Elena remained at attention while Colonel Hawkins continued her inquiry. "My understanding is that you were conducting familiarization training rather than responding to emergency calls for air support. Can you explain how your training mission became a solo combat operation against superior enemy forces?" The question highlighted the fundamental problem with General Donovan's assignment of Elena to dangerous terrain under the pretense of basic training. Colonel Hawkins was obviously aware that something inappropriate had occurred, and her investigation would likely expose the vindictive motivations behind Elena's original mission assignment. General Donovan intervened before Elena was required to respond to questions that might force her to criticize her commanding officer's decisions. "Colonel Hawkins, the responsibility for today's events rests entirely with my command decisions. Captain Vasquez was assigned to a training route that exceeded appropriate difficulty levels for familiarization flights, and she responded to an emergency situation with the professionalism and competence that her record indicates we should have expected from someone with her qualifications. But General Donovan's acknowledgement of responsibility was only the beginning of what would prove to be a complete reversal of his assessment of Elena's capabilities and worth as a member of the Thunderhawk squadron." Reaching into his uniform pocket, he withdrew a manila folder that contained documents Elena had never seen before. "Captain Vasquez," he said, opening the folder to reveal official military paperwork, "these are recommendations for immediate promotion and assignment to advanced combat leadership positions. Your performance today has demonstrated that you possess the kind of exceptional abilities that the military cannot afford to waste on routine assignments." Elena accepted the documents with surprise that she managed to conceal behind her professional military bearing. The paperwork indicated recommendations for promotion to major, assignment to squadron leadership positions, and consideration for the distinguished flying cross based on her rescue of Viper 6 under extraordinary combat conditions. The most significant gesture was yet to come. General Donovan stepped back, removed his military cap in full view of the maintenance personnel and other officers who had gathered to witness Elena's return from her emergency mission, and rendered a formal military salute that acknowledged her as a superior pilot whose abilities had exceeded his own demonstrated capabilities in identical operational conditions. The salute was held with perfect military precision for the regulation duration. creating a moment of recognition that transcended normal command relationships and acknowledged competence regardless of rank, gender, or previous assumptions about who belonged in combat aviation roles. When General Donovan finally lowered his salute and replaced his cap, the gesture had been witnessed by dozens of military personnel who understood its significance as an unprecedented acknowledgement of exceptional performance. Colonel Hawkins observed the entire exchange with obvious approval, making notes that would become part of her official report on pilot proficiency and command effectiveness at Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk. Her evaluation would ultimately result in policy changes that prevented future incidents where qualified personnel were subjected to inappropriate testing. Based on bias rather than professional assessment, Elena returned the salute with equal precision before responding to General Donovan's unprecedented gesture of respect. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored to serve with the Thunderhawk Squadron and grateful for the opportunity to contribute to mission success in this operational environment." Her response reflected the same professional courtesy that had characterized her behavior since arriving at the base, despite the hostile treatment she had received and the dangerous mission that had resulted from General Donovan's vindictive assignment of inappropriate training exercises. Elena's dignity under pressure had been as impressive as her flying abilities, demonstrating character qualities that were as valuable as technical competence in military leadership positions. The transformation at Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk following Elena's extraordinary rescue mission was immediate and comprehensive, affecting every aspect of squadron operations and interpersonal dynamics among personnel who had witnessed the most remarkable demonstration of combat flying in recent military history. The crude jokes and dismissive attitudes that had characterized Elena's initial reception were permanently replaced by genuine professional respect and recognition of her exceptional capabilities as a combat pilot. Major Rodriguez, the operations officer who had attempted to warn Elena about the dangers of mountain flying, was among the first to acknowledge the fundamental shift in how squadron personnel viewed their newest member. During the post-mission briefing session, he stood before the assembled pilots and delivered an assessment that reflected both professional admiration and personal humility about his own misconceptions. What Captain Vasquez accomplished today represents the kind of flying that gets studied in advanced tactical courses and written about in aviation history books, Rodriguez announced to the room full of experienced combat pilots. She executed a solo rescue mission under conditions that would challenge an entire squadron working in coordination, and she did it with precision that saved 12 American lives while sustaining minimal aircraft damage, despite overwhelming enemy opposition. The assembled pilots listened in respectful silence as Rodriguez continued his analysis of Elena's performance. These were men who had collectively accumulated thousands of combat flight hours across multiple deployments, and their recognition of exceptional competence carried weight that no amount of formal commendation could match. More importantly, Rodriguez added, Captain Vasquez demonstrated the kind of judgment and professionalism that distinguishes genuine military aviators from those who merely operate aircraft. She made the correct tactical decisions under extreme pressure, managed her resources effectively throughout the engagement, and maintained situational awareness that enabled her to accomplish an impossible mission while bringing her aircraft home safely. Captain Torres, the experienced pilot who had offered Elena advice about mountain flying conditions, approached her after the briefing with an expression of genuine respect that reflected his understanding of what she had accomplished under conditions that would have tested the abilities of the most seasoned aviators in the squadron. Captain Vasquez, Torres said formally, I want to apologize for assuming that you needed basic advice about mountain flying when you clearly possess more experience and skill in challenging conditions than anyone currently assigned to this base. Your performance today was extraordinary by any measure, and I'm honored to serve in the same squadron with someone of your capabilities. Elena accepted his acknowledgement with the same professional courtesy that had characterized her response to both hostility and recognition since arriving at Thunderhawk. "Thank you, Captain Torres. Your advice about communication dead zones and emergency procedures was valuable information that contributed to mission success. Professional pilots always benefit from local knowledge and experience shared by their colleagues. But the most significant change in squadron dynamics occurred during the evening briefing session, where Colonel Hawkins announced policy modifications that would prevent future incidents involving inappropriate mission assignments based on bias rather than professional assessment of pilot capabilities. Effective immediately, Colonel Hawkins declared to the assembled personnel, all familiarization flights and training exercises will be conducted according to standardized protocols that ensure appropriate difficulty progression and adequate safety margins. No pilot will be assigned to advanced training routes without demonstrated proficiency in prerequisite skills and comprehensive mission preparation." Her announcement was clearly directed at preventing the kind of vindictive assignment that had resulted in Elena's unauthorized combat mission, though Colonel Hawkins was diplomatically avoiding direct criticism of General Donovan's command decisions in front of squadron personnel. "Additionally," she continued, "this base will implement formal mentorship programs that pair newly assigned pilots with experienced aviators who can provide guidance and support during the integration process. The goal is to ensure that all personnel are positioned for success rather than subjected to testing that serves no constructive purpose." Elena understood that these policy changes were direct results of her experience at Thunderhawk, and that future pilots would benefit from protections that hadn't been available during her own assignment to the squadron. But she also recognized that institutional change was less important than the personal transformation that had occurred in General Donovan's understanding of leadership and professional responsibility. 3 days after her rescue of Viper 6, Elena was approached by General Donovan with a request that demonstrated the depth of his recognition of her exceptional abilities and professional judgment. He asked her to develop and conduct advanced combat training exercises for newly assigned pilots, utilizing her experience with mountain flying and emergency response procedures to prepare others for the challenging conditions they might encounter in the Korathian operational environment. "Captain Vasquez," General Donovan said formally, "I want you to design training programs that will help other pilots develop the kind of skills you demonstrated during the Viper 6 rescue. Your experience and expertise represent exactly the kind of knowledge that this squadron needs to ensure mission success and personnel safety in challenging operational conditions." Elena accepted the assignment with characteristic professionalism, understanding that her role had evolved from being tested by the squadron to helping establish the standards that would define excellence in combat aviation at Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk. She began developing training curricula that emphasized the kind of systematic preparation and tactical decision-making that had enabled her to succeed under impossible conditions. Her first training session was conducted for a group of newly assigned pilots who had arrived at Thunderhawk after Elena's rescue mission had become known throughout the military aviation community. Unlike the hostile reception she had received, these new pilots approached their training with obvious respect for someone whose combat performance had exceeded anything in recent military history. Elena's instructional approach reflected the same methodical thoroughness that had characterized her mission preparation and combat execution. She emphasized systematic risk assessment, comprehensive emergency procedures, and the kind of tactical flexibility that enabled pilots to respond effectively to rapidly changing conditions that couldn't be anticipated through standard training exercises. "Combat flying isn't about individual heroics or exceptional circumstances," Elena explained to the assembled trainees. "It's about consistent application of proper techniques under pressure, systematic preparation for contingencies, and the judgment to make correct decisions when lives depend on your performance." Her students listened with the kind of focused attention that reflected their understanding that they were receiving instruction from someone whose combat experience had been validated under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Elena's reputation had spread throughout the military aviation community, but her teaching style remained humble and focused on practical application of lessons learned through hard experience. During one training session, a newly assigned pilot asked Elena about the psychological pressure of conducting solo combat missions against superior enemy forces. Her response reflected both the confidence that came from proven competence and the humility that characterized genuine professionals. The key to managing pressure is thorough preparation and focus on mission objectives rather than personal risk. Elena replied, "If you've prepared properly and understand your capabilities, the aircraft systems, and the tactical situation, then you can trust your training and experience to guide your decisions under pressure." But Elena's most important contribution to squadron operations wasn't her individual flying ability or her development of training programs. It was the example she provided of how professional competence and personal dignity could overcome prejudice and transform institutional culture through demonstrated excellence rather than confrontational arguments about fairness or equality. Within 6 months of her assignment to Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk, Elena had become the unofficial standard by which combat flying excellence was measured, not because of gender or politics, but because her performance under extreme conditions had established benchmarks for competence that inspired other pilots to elevate their own professional capabilities. 6 months after Elena's extraordinary rescue of Viper 6 in the Korathian mountains, her story had become legendary throughout the global military aviation community, spreading far beyond Forward Operating Base Thunderhawk to reach pilots, instructors, and command personnel across multiple service branches and allied nations. But the viral nature of her story wasn't driven by official military publicity or promotional campaigns. It was the result of organic recognition from professionals who understood exactly how difficult her achievement had been under the conditions she had faced. The catalyst for widespread recognition was a photograph that appeared on a restricted military aviation forum accessible only to certified combat pilots and authorized flight training personnel. The powerful image showed General Donovan standing on the Thunderhawk flight line in full desert camouflage, his military cap held respectfully at his side, rendering a formal salute to Elena as she stood beside her battle-damaged Apache helicopter. After completing the most remarkable single aircraft rescue mission in recent military history, the photograph had been taken by a base photographer who was documenting aircraft damage assessments, but the image captured something far more significant than routine maintenance procedures. It showed a senior commanding officer acknowledging exceptional competence through the kind of formal recognition that transcended normal military hierarchy, demonstrating that genuine professional excellence could overcome prejudice and transform relationships built on false assumptions. The caption accompanying the viral photograph was simple, but devastatingly accurate. "When the pilot you publicly dismissed successfully completes the combat mission you couldn't execute." Within hours of being posted, the image had generated hundreds of comments from military aviators around the world who recognized the deeper significance of what the photograph represented. Comments began appearing from pilots across multiple conflict zones who shared similar experiences of witnessing competence triumph over bias through demonstrated performance under pressure. The responses revealed a pattern of professional recognition that extended far beyond Elena's individual achievement. Thunderhawk Base. This is Major Sarah Chun, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. We've heard about Captain Vasquez's rescue mission throughout our operational community. That kind of precision flying under combat conditions represents the gold standard for attack helicopter operations. Forward Operating Base Dragon, Afghanistan. Captain Rodriguez here. Elena Vasquez flew with our unit during Operation Desert Falcon. Everyone in the squadron knew she was exceptional long before Thunderhawk. There's always someone who assumes competence is about politics until performance proves otherwise. This is Colonel Michael Stevens, Marine Corps Air Station Yuma. I've been flying attack helicopters for 15 years, and what Captain Vasquez accomplished in the Korathia Mountains exceeds anything I've witnessed in terms of single pilot combat effectiveness. Her tactical decisions were flawless under impossible conditions. Naval Air Station Oceana. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Walsh. Elena's story is required reading for our advanced helicopter training courses. Her systematic approach to emergency response demonstrates exactly the kind of professionalism that saves lives when standard procedures aren't adequate for the situation. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source, Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane, the team leader of Viper 6, who had been evacuated from the Korathia Mountains after Elena's rescue mission and had subsequently been awarded the Silver Star for his unit's performance under extreme combat conditions. Captain Elena Vasquez saved 12 American lives through flying that shouldn't be possible under those conditions. Kane wrote in his online tribute, "She engaged 60 enemy fighters in terrain that gave them every tactical advantage while managing severe aircraft damage and limited ammunition. What she accomplished wasn't just exceptional piloting, it was the kind of heroism that defines the best of military service." Kane's testimony carried particular weight because he had witnessed Elena's performance from the ground, under fire, where the consequences of pilot error would have been immediate and fatal for his entire team. His description of her precision and tactical judgment provided details that weren't available in official mission reports. Elena never wasted a shot, never exposed her aircraft unnecessarily, and never compromised our safety while engaged in enemy positions. She maintained perfect situational awareness throughout the engagement and executed maneuvers that eliminated specific threats without causing collateral damage. Every member of Viper 6 owes their life to her exceptional competence under pressure. The international recognition that followed. Elena's story had practical consequences that extended beyond personal acknowledgement. Her rescue mission became a case study in advanced helicopter tactics courses at military academies worldwide, where her decision-making process and technical execution were analyzed as examples of optimal performance under extreme conditions. The U.S. Army Aviation Center at Fort Rucker incorporated Elena's mission into their curriculum for advanced attack helicopter training, using detailed reconstructions of her tactical approaches and weapon system employment to teach future pilots about precision engagement in challenging terrain. Her systematic preparation and emergency response procedures became standard components of instruction for pilots assigned to combat operations. International military aviation schools requested copies of Elena's mission planning materials and post-action reports to help develop training programs that emphasized the kind of thorough preparation and tactical flexibility that had enabled her success. Her methodical approach to risk assessment and contingency planning was recognized as a model for professional aviation excellence that transcended cultural and organizational boundaries. Elena herself remained characteristically modest about the recognition her story had generated throughout the global military community. When approached by journalists and military historians who wanted to document her achievement, she consistently redirected attention toward the systematic training and institutional support that had prepared her for success under extreme conditions. My performance in the Korathia Mountains was the result of excellent training, professional colleagues who shared their knowledge, and institutional support that provided the resources necessary for mission success, Elena explained during a formal interview with Military Aviation Quarterly. Individual achievements in military aviation are always built on collective contributions from many professionals who work together to ensure mission effectiveness. But Elena's humility couldn't diminish the significance of what she had accomplished, or the lasting impact her story would have on military aviation culture. Her demonstration that competence transcends demographics had helped accelerate changes in policies and attitudes that benefited all personnel who faced skepticism, based on appearance rather than proven ability. 2 years after her rescue of Viper 6, Elena was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to command her own attack helicopter squadron, where she implemented training programs based on the systematic preparation and professional excellence that had characterized her own development. As a combat pilot, her leadership style emphasized competence over politics, performance over prejudice, and the kind of institutional culture that evaluated personnel based on demonstrated capabilities rather than superficial characteristics. The squadron under Elena's command became known throughout the military aviation community for exceptional mission success rates and professional development programs that consistently produced outstanding combat pilots regardless of their background or previous experience. Her legacy wasn't just a remarkable rescue mission that had made her famous, it was the institutional change that ensured future generations of military aviators would be evaluated fairly based on their professional competence and contributions to mission success. For Elena Vasquez, the girl from Silverton, Colorado, who had grown up around helicopters and dreamed of serving her country through military aviation, the journey from dismissed trainee to respected squadron commander represented more than personal achievement. It was proof that excellence speaks louder than prejudice, that competence transcends assumptions, and that genuine professional performance creates opportunities for everyone who follows the same path of systematic preparation, humble service, and unwavering commitment to mission success above personal recognition. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.